The Illusion of Testificate Village. Written by Egriff. Narrated by Egriff. Chapter 1. Punch. 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 His arms grew weak with the continuous motion of destroying trees block by block to gather wood for making planks. He was tired of doing this day after day, but it was his job. He was happy to have a job and live in a nice wooden and cobblestone house instead of the dirt huts that the newbies made for themselves. He earned 1 iron ingot, 5 pieces of coal, and a piece of flint every week. Most others that had the same job only earned the pieces of coal, but Steve, at least that's what everyone calls him, decided to stay with his current job instead of accepting the various promotions he was offered. He knew the importance of his job, because without workers like him, the miners would have no pickaxes, the archers would have no bows, and most importantly, the general population would have no comfortable place to return to at night. Whenever he came across this thought, he wondered how everything was made. Steve had heard about crafting, but assumed it was just a rumor. All he knew was that he delivered his stacks of wood to the same cobblestone building every evening, and if he needed something, he simply had to walk to a large building made of glowstone, ask for whatever he needed, and throw the appropriate payment of materials down the chute covered by a simple trapdoor, and his items would arrive via a minecart with the chest inside. That sound was familiar to Steve. He dove for the nearest shelter, specifically designed for creeper attacks. He barely had time to completely hide himself in the shelter as the creeper exploded with a gigantic boom. This wasn't a typical creeper explosion. Normally, the shock of the blast was absorbed by the obsidian surrounding the shelters, but Steve could feel the complete damaging effect of this particular blast. Several stacks of wood Steve was carrying, and a complete chunk of the forest was destroyed. Steve peeked out over the edge of the shelter and nearly lost the pork chops he had eaten earlier. The blast had left him suspended in midair, only supported by 2 dirt blocks to the left of the shelter. It was getting late, and he knew he was trapped, and that his only chance of survival depended on the guards looking out beyond the city for any unusual activity. He launched his only ender eye into the air, hoping that someone would see it. Then he collapsed. Steve awoke to the familiar smell of mushroom stew and bread baking in a furnace. He looked around, but saw nothing. There was a redstone torch to his left for minimal lighting, and a lever in front of him. The only thing he could do was pull the lever, and by doing so, he activated 2 pistons that were keeping his room concealed. He didn't recognize this house, and when he peered through the windows, he saw nothing but trees and hills. This seemed like the usual environment he would work in every day, but he had expected to wake up in the city. Suddenly, the door swung open, and 2 figures entered the room. Instinctively, Steve reached for his backpack to find something to defend himself with, but his pack was not there. Seeing the defensive and confused look on his face, the taller figure cried out, "Wait! We mean you no harm!" Steve relaxed, but did not let his guard down.
"Yes, we mean you no harm,"
the shorter figure said with a slightly higher voice than the taller of the two. Again, the taller one spoke. "My name is Bob Testificate, and this is my wife, Mary Testificate," he said, as he pointed to himself first, and then to the shorter figure next to him. "We found you laying in an obsidian shelter out in the middle of the forest. It looked as if the land around you had been destroyed by a creeper, or a very crudely placed block of TNT.
Where am I?"
Steve weakly asked.
"Try not to talk too much,"
Mary said.
"We don't want the effects of the mushroom stew to wear off."
Bob explained that Steve was currently staying in Testificate Village, a village that was thought to have been wiped off the map by creepers. As night fell, Bob and Mary were looking more and more worried. Curious, Steve asked for an explanation, but before anyone could answer, there was a deafening crash as the door was being broke down. Bob lunged for a lever on the wider side of the house and pulled it down, revealing a completely hidden room, but as the pistons finished working, Steve took a closer look and saw that this hidden portion of the house was an exact copy of the part he was standing in. The only difference was that the hidden portion didn't have any doors or windows. "Move now!" Bob shouted at the top of his lungs as he motioned for Steve and Mary to enter the other half of the house. As soon as everyone was safe, Bob pulled another lever and closed the wall once again. "What's going on?" Steve demanded. "Zombies," Bob nervously replied as the door was broken down with another deafening crash. Chapter 2. The loud roars of the enraged zombies filled the house, as one by one they piled in. Steve and the others cowered in fear, hoping that the zombies wouldn't find their way into the other half of the house. The roaring and crashing continued as the zombies broke into house after house until sunrise. Just before the sun completely rose, the zombies quickly returned to their dark caverns and into the shade among the forest. Night after night this continued. Houses were destroyed, small wheat patches were demolished, and various other things were destroyed. Occasionally, the unaware Testificates would be slain by the zombies. Luckily, Steve was staying with two of the most aware and prepared Testificates in the whole village. Even so, Steve had had enough of these constant attacks, and with a few crafting lessons from Bob, Steve created something that would protect the village forever: the Iron Golem. He used most of the leftover iron ingots in his pack, and a pumpkin he luckily found growing in the forest. A few Testificates were doubtful that an iron statue could protect an entire village. Steve knew that they were right, so he went off into an abandoned mine shaft, not returning for 1 month. When he finally returned, half of the village was destroyed, including Bob and Mary's house. Now the remaining Testificates were willing to try anything to prevent themselves from suffering any longer. Steve crafted a crude furnace and melted some cobblestone into smooth stone. He pulled some redstone torches from his pack and crafted a very crude object. He called it a repeater, and said that it would repeat any actions it was programmed to do. It took him a while to find the old golem he had made so long ago, but he finally found it among the remains of Bob and Mary's house. He fitted the redstone repeater into the back of the golem and enclosed it with a thin plate of iron. The iron golem sprang to life, and its eyes glowed a bright yellow and started to move toward the big group of Testificates. Frightened, they all ran inside the nearest houses. The golem froze and looked around, confused. It seemed that the redstone repeater not only gave the golem movement, it also gave it intelligence. Night. It seemed to take forever for the zombies to arrive this time. Some thought that Steve's invention may have just been a big waste of time, and that the zombies had forgotten about the village. Just then, something happened that proved every one of them wrong. Zombie after zombie flooded the village. Even a few creepers and skeletons joined in. Sensing danger, the Iron Golem rushed to destroy every threat to the village. It seemed that the monsters had the advantage, but as the golem wildly swung its arms, more and more monsters were defeated, in a puff of smoke. Everyone cheered as the golem finished off the last zombie. Seeing that it had finished its job, the golem returned to the place where it was built. Steve was known as the hero of Testificate Village from then on. Chapter 3. Steve was happy that he had saved the Testificate Village, and now had his own house there. However, life in the village soon grew dull, and he wanted to return to the city. The only way to the city was to take an extremely dangerous trip through a place known as the Nether, and this place was only accessible through a portal. Obtaining access to a portal is nearly as dangerous as the trip itself, so it's a good chance to get familiar with the danger. However, most who attempt to try to make a portal usually don't survive the trip to gather the necessary materials. Steve tried to take the Iron Golem with him to protect him from any danger, but it refused to leave the village. It knew of its importance to the Testificates. Steve finally decided to attempt to gather the materials by himself. He gathered his pickaxe, his armor and swords, and the most important thing of all, a crafting bench that once belonged to Bob. Steve laughed as he remembered how he thought crafting was some silly rumor. After this, he went off into the only cave that was accessible from the surface. Scree! Scree! The sound of the spiders echoed in the walls along the unbearable roaring with the zombies. Steve placed a few torches as he would allow himself. He decided that he may need some extras in the near future. After hours of walking and avoiding as many monsters as possible, Steve came across a sign that said, Unmarked Zone. He knew that beyond this point, all area was unexplored and that he'd have the best chance of finding obsidian this way. There was a strange glow ahead. Steve normally would have completely ignored it, as it could be dangerous, but he had to find obsidian as fast as possible, and usually a glow means lava, and obsidian is commonly found near lava. As he rushed towards the glow, the sound of spiders, zombies, and skeletons dissipated, and they were replaced by a low mumbling. Steve saw what looked like another person standing among shelves filled with books. The mumbling must be coming from this person, Steve thought. Not knowing whether he was in danger or not, Steve prepared to draw his sword. Without even moving or turning around, the person standing ahead of Steve calmly said, Relax, young Steve. There is no danger here. How do you know my name? Steve loudly replied. The person replied, I know everything, Steve. Especially about your journey down here. You need a portal to get home to the place you call the city. Well, I'm afraid I can't let you do that. For you see, you are too valuable for us to just let you go. Who are you? Steve yelled. The person turned around, and Steve gasped in disbelief. Chapter 4. Bob? Steve couldn't believe his eyes. Yes, Steve, it's me, Bob, Bob replied. What are you doing here? Steve questioned. I'm watching you, of course, Bob said. Watching me? Steve exclaimed. What do you mean you're watching me? Bob suddenly slumped over, and his mumbling resumed, even louder than before. Slowly his body changed from a Testificate into an Enderman. We're always watching, Bob hissed. Always. And with that, Bob disappeared in a wisp of smoke. Steve suddenly felt uneasy, and he heard a noise that sickened him even more. Hiss. A creeper? No. A creeper's fuse doesn't last that long. TNT? No, its fuse doesn't last that long either. Steve nearly went insane. He closed his eyes and covered his ears, flailing around trying to make the noise stop. Steve opened his eyes. A redstone torch to his left, and a lever in front of him. Was that all the simple dream? He hoped so. He reached out for the lever, but before he could pull it, the pistons were activated, and he was face to face with Bob Testificate. Hello, Steve, Bob calmly spoke. Hello, Bob. It's nice to see... Steve cut his sentence short. Wait a second, Steve said. I've never met you before. How do you know my name? Bob suddenly changed back into an Enderman. Remember, Steve, we're always watching. Steve screamed and closed his eyes again. When he opened them, he was back in the cave where he was looking for obsidian. Was that a nightmare? Steve was pondering what had happened to him. Suddenly, Bob's voice filled his head. No, Steve, it wasn't a nightmare. I can manipulate your thoughts, thanks to this ender eye I found when I rescued you. I can use the eye to manipulate your thoughts and sight, and I can see every move you make. Bob's voice slowly faded, and Steve started to run as fast as he could, where he thought the entrance to the cave was. I've had enough, Steve started saying to himself. I can't take it anymore. Steve hurled himself towards what he thought was the exit, but as he got closer, he flailed his arms trying to find something to grab a hold before he landed in the giant lake of lava he just launched himself towards. Chapter 5. Final chapter. At the last second, the lava disappeared, and Steve landed on cold, hard stone blocks. Another illusion, he thought. He started to get up, but he froze as he thought of something. Is it just Bob who is an Enderman? Or are they all Endermen? Steve began to think about this carefully. Scree! Scree! Steve didn't notice the noise until the last moment. Suddenly, a group of small spiders appeared out of nowhere and began their assault on Steve. Twang! 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 The spiders were picked off one by a mysterious person. Steve didn't have time to clearly see who this person was before he collapsed from the poison in his system. Steve awoke inside a small tent with a campfire blazing outside. He could smell pork chops being cooked, and he could hear tools and weapons being made out of stone and metal. A woman entered his tent, carrying a couple of cooked pork chops and a bucket of milk. Steve noticed she carried a bow and quiver on her back. Here, drink this. She handed him a bucket of milk, and Steve thirstily drank it all. My name is Elizabeth, she began. What the heck were you doing near this cave spider's den? That place is extremely dangerous. Steve didn't think anyone would believe he was being manipulated by an Enderman, so he just said, I didn't know where I was. I felt really lost, so I just stopped and tried to rest. Where am I anyway? Steve asked. Elizabeth replied, This is the camp for all the survivors who were trying to find materials for a portal to escape Testificate Village and go back to the city. The city? Steve exclaimed. I'm trying to do the exact same thing. The clock in Elizabeth's backpack started to beep. Be right back, she said as she exited the tent. Steve sat up and could hear her distant shouting. Pull the levers and release the water barricades. We don't want any of those Endermen to get into our camp. Move it, let's go! There were loud noises as the pistons moved aside and released the water downwards to barricade the camp from the Endermen. Hours passed. Steve attended the evening feast, which consisted of cooked pork chops and plenty of mushroom stew. Afterwards, Steve was chosen to tag along during the monster hunt. Since it was his first time, he didn't gather much. He looked at what everyone else had looted. There was one man in particular, his name was Charles, who had collected the most things. Charles emptied his pack, and at least 5 stacks of arrows fell out, along with lots of gunpowder and some string from the spiders. Steve later learned that Charles was the captain of the monster hunting groups, and that he possessed a weapon that no one else had ever seen. It was an iron sword, like the rest of them, but it had a purplish glow. Charles said it was enchanted. Everyone else said that Charles had been through a portal once, and by doing that, he had obtained the glowing sword from a pig that stood on 2 feet. All of the common items were stored in a chest for later use, and anything special was laid out on a crafting bench to distribute amongst the hunters. Since it was Steve's first time hunting, he had to pick last. All that was left over was some redstone. No one really knew how to use redstone, except Steve, of course. After a few hours, Steve had crafted some dispensers and some buttons. They were a huge help to the camp. They allowed anyone to have super fast access to food, materials, weapons, and tools. One day, Steve had found something that would change the camp forever. Steve had signed up for a solo hunt, and during this, he came across a dungeon. After clearing the dungeon of monsters, he opened the chest inside. Inside were 2 saplings. This meant that the camp could switch from tents to actual houses, and they wouldn't have to worry about tools wearing out anymore. They could possibly find a way out of here. I hope you enjoyed that story. I wrote it last year. I was on vacation, and let's just say internet access wasn't exactly available, so I just typed this up on my iPod, and, well, it turned out to be a really good story. I didn't finish it. I don't think I'm going to finish it, because it kind of leaves to the mystery of everything, I guess. I mean, if you would like to create your own ending, I'd be happy to read them all. That'd be great, actually. But I don't think I myself am going to finish this, so that's about all. So, thanks for listening. I'm Egriff. I'll see you in the next one.